In December 1944, the Western Front exploded into chaos. The German Wehrmacht launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes Forest, creating a bulge in the Allied lines that would give the battle its name. As American forces reeled from the initial shock, British Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery saw an opportunity. What happened next would create one of the most bitter controversies of World War II, a clash of personalities, strategies, and national pride that nearly tore the Allied command structure apart. Montgomery's demands in the aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge would reveal not just his tactical thinking, but his fundamental misunderstanding of American military culture and the changing nature of the Allied coalition. To understand what Montgomery demanded and why, we need to understand the man himself and the strategic situation in late 1944. Bernard Montgomery was Britain's most famous general, the victor of El Alamein, the commander who had driven Rommel out of North Africa. He was meticulous, cautious, and absolutely convinced of his own military genius. He was also prickly, arrogant, and dismissive of American military capabilities. Montgomery believed in the concentrated thrust, the carefully prepared set-piece battle, and the importance of not taking unnecessary risks. By December 1944, Montgomery commanded 21st Army Group, consisting of the British Second Army and the Canadian First Army, operating in the northern sector of the Western Front. To his south, American forces under General Omar Bradley commanded 12th Army Group, which included Courtney Hodges's First Army, George Patton's Third Army, and William Simpson's Ninth Army. The Supreme Commander was General Dwight Eisenhower, who had to balance the competing demands, egos, and national interests of this coalition. The strategic debate that fall had been bitter. Montgomery wanted a single, concentrated thrust into Germany, with himself in command, driving through the Low Countries and across the North German plain to Berlin. Eisenhower preferred a broad front strategy, advancing along the entire line, which would prevent the Germans from concentrating their forces and would allow all Allied armies to contribute. Montgomery viewed this as timid and wasteful. He believed American generals were amateurs who didn't understand the art of war. Operation Market Garden. In September 1944 had been Montgomery's attempt to prove his strategy correct. The ambitious airborne operation aimed to seize bridges across the Rhine and outflank German defenses. It failed catastrophically at Arnhem, with the British 1st Airborne Division destroyed and the advance stalled. Montgomery blamed everyone but himself: insufficient forces, bad weather, unexpected German resistance. American commanders noted that Montgomery's planning had been rushed and optimistic, very unlike his usual cautious approach. Then came the Ardennes Offensive. On December 16, 1944, 3 German armies smashed into the American lines in Belgium and Luxembourg. The attack achieved complete surprise. Inexperienced American divisions were overrun, communication lines were cut, and within days, a dangerous bulge had been driven deep into Allied territory. The Germans were aiming for Antwerp, hoping to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace. The initial American response was confused but determined. Units fought desperate holding actions. Bastogne, a critical road junction, was surrounded but held by the 101st Airborne Division. Eisenhower rushed reinforcements to the threatened sector, but the command structure was a problem. Omar Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg was south of the bulge, making communication with his First Army, north of the penetration, difficult, and dangerous. On December 19th, Eisenhower made a crucial decision. He temporarily transferred command of all American forces north of the Bulge, including Hodges's First Army and portions of Simpson's Ninth Army, to Montgomery's 21st Army Group. This was a purely practical decision based on geography and communications. Montgomery was positioned to coordinate the northern response while Bradley managed the southern counterattack. It was supposed to be a temporary battlefield expedient. Montgomery saw it differently. He viewed this as vindication, proof that Eisenhower had finally recognized the need for a single ground commander, namely himself. When Montgomery arrived at Hodges' headquarters on December 20th, he made an entrance calculated to demonstrate British superiority. He arrived with his typical theatrical flair, in his staff car with his personal liaison officers, wearing his trademark beret with 2 badges, exuding confidence while American commanders were still reeling from the shock of the German attack. What happened at that meeting, and in the following days, has been debated ever since. American officers present described Montgomery as condescending and patronizing, treating them like incompetent students. Montgomery's own account portrayed him as the calm professional taking charge of a chaotic situation. The truth was probably somewhere in between, but Montgomery's manner certainly didn't help Anglo-American relations. Montgomery immediately began reorganizing the northern defense. He pulled back some exposed American units, consolidated the lines, and established reserves. These were sensible tactical decisions, the kind of thing Montgomery did well. But he also sent a series of messages to London and to Eisenhower that revealed his true thinking. He believed the American command had failed, that the broad front strategy had been proven wrong, and that he needed to be given overall ground command to salvage the situation. Meanwhile, the battle was turning. American units were fighting with desperate courage. At Bastogne, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe delivered his famous one-word response to a German surrender demand: nuts. The 101st Airborne and attached units held the town against repeated German attacks. In the north, American forces were stabilizing the line, and in the south, George Patton was performing one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war. Patton's Third Army was engaged in offensive operations in the Saar region when the Ardennes offensive began. Within days, Patton disengaged 3 divisions, turned them 90 degrees north, and sent them racing through winter conditions to relieve Bastogne. This was exactly the kind of rapid, aggressive armored warfare that Montgomery claimed Americans couldn't execute. Patton's tanks broke through to Bastogne on December 26th, just 10 days after the German offensive began. The German offensive was already failing. They had failed to capture the critical fuel dumps they needed. American resistance had been much tougher than expected. The weather cleared, allowing Allied air power to devastate German columns. By early January, the Germans were retreating, and the Allies were preparing counterattacks to eliminate the Bulge. This is where Montgomery's demands became most controversial. On January 3, 1945, Montgomery launched his counterattack from the north. It was characteristically cautious and methodical. At the same time, Patton was attacking aggressively from the south. The two forces were supposed to meet and trap the retreating Germans. But Montgomery's advance was slow. American commanders believed he was being overly cautious, allowing the Germans to escape. Montgomery believed he was being properly careful, avoiding unnecessary casualties. The strategic debate was really about two different philosophies of war. Montgomery believed in the careful, prepared attack, with overwhelming force, at a decisive point. He thought American generals were reckless and wasteful of lives. American commanders believed in aggressive action, exploitation of opportunities, and maintaining momentum. They thought Montgomery was timid and allowed enemies to escape. On January 7, 1945, Montgomery held a press conference. What he said there would create a firestorm of controversy that threatened the Allied coalition itself. Montgomery described how he had taken command of the Northern forces during the crisis, how he had organized the defense, and how British troops had played a crucial role in stopping the German advance. He praised American soldiers, but implied that American command had failed and that British leadership had saved the situation. The press conference was a disaster. American newspapers erupted in fury. Headlines accused Montgomery of stealing credit for an American victory. The Battle of the Bulge had been overwhelmingly an American battle. Of the 600,000 American troops engaged, only 55,000 were British. American casualties were over 80,000. British casualties were around 1,400. Montgomery's implication that British command had saved the Americans was seen as insulting and false. The political fallout was immediate and severe. American public opinion turned sharply against Montgomery. American generals were furious. Even Eisenhower, normally diplomatic, was angry. Churchill had to intervene, making a speech in the House of Commons praising American courage and sacrifice in the Ardennes. The Prime Minister understood that the alliance was more important than Montgomery's ego. But Montgomery wasn't finished with his demands. In the aftermath of the Bulge, he sent a series of messages to Eisenhower and to the British Chiefs of Staff, arguing for fundamental changes in command structure. He wanted to be appointed overall ground forces commander, with operational control over all Allied armies in Northwest Europe. He wanted the broad front strategy abandoned in favor of his concentrated northern thrust. He wanted American armies to play a supporting role, while his 21st Army Group made the main effort into Germany. Montgomery's argument was that the Battle of the Bulge had proven the broad front strategy was bankrupt. The Germans had been able to concentrate forces and achieve surprise because Allied forces were spread too thin. A concentrated thrust under single command, his command, would prevent such disasters and would end the war more quickly. He believed American commanders lacked the experience and skill for high-level command, and that only he could provide the necessary direction. What Montgomery failed to understand was that his demands were politically impossible and strategically questionable. By early 1945, American forces in Europe vastly outnumbered British forces. The United States was providing the majority of troops, equipment, and supplies. American public opinion would never accept American armies serving under permanent British command. Congress would have erupted. The political cost would have been catastrophic. Eisenhower understood this, even if Montgomery didn't. Eisenhower was not just a military commander, but a political leader, managing a coalition. He had to balance military effectiveness with political reality. He had to keep the alliance together while defeating Germany. Montgomery's demands threatened to tear the alliance apart for questionable military gain. Moreover, Montgomery's strategic vision was flawed. The concentrated northern thrust he advocated would have left German forces in the south free to operate. It would have created a dangerous, exposed flank. It would have required American armies to remain passive, while Montgomery slowly advanced. The broad front strategy, whatever its flaws, kept pressure on Germany along the entire line, prevented the Germans from concentrating their reserves, and allowed the Allies to exploit weaknesses wherever they appeared. Montgomery also fundamentally misunderstood American military culture. American commanders valued initiative, aggression, and exploitation of success. Patton's relief of Bastogne was a perfect example. Montgomery would never have attempted such a maneuver because it involved risk and uncertainty. But it worked. And it worked because American doctrine emphasized speed and flexibility over careful preparation. The contrast between Montgomery's counterattack from the north and Patton's attack from the south illustrated this perfectly. Montgomery advanced slowly and methodically, taking few casualties but also allowing many Germans to escape. Patton attacked aggressively, took more risks, suffered more casualties, but also destroyed more German units and advanced faster. Neither approach was absolutely right or wrong, but they reflected fundamentally different military philosophies. Eisenhower's response to Montgomery's demands was firm but diplomatic. On January 17th, he sent Montgomery a message making clear that the temporary command arrangement during the bulge was ending. American forces would return to Bradley's command. The broad front strategy would continue. There would be no single ground forces commander other than Eisenhower himself. If Montgomery couldn't accept this, Eisenhower would request his relief. This was as close as Eisenhower ever came to firing Montgomery. It worked. Montgomery backed down, sending a conciliatory message accepting Eisenhower's decision. But the damage to Anglo-American relations had been done. American commanders would never fully trust Montgomery again. Bradley and Patton particularly despised him. Even Eisenhower's patience with Montgomery was wearing thin. The British Chiefs of Staff, particularly Field Marshal Alan Brooke, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, supported Montgomery's strategic vision. Brooke believed Eisenhower was a mediocre strategist and that Montgomery should have overall ground command. But Churchill understood the political realities. Britain was the junior partner in the alliance now. American power was dominant. British interests required maintaining the alliance, even if it meant swallowing pride and accepting American command. What's fascinating is what Montgomery demanded versus what actually happened in the final months of the war. Montgomery got his Rhine crossing operation, Operation Plunder, in March 1945, a massive, carefully prepared set-piece battle that was vintage Montgomery. But Patton crossed the Rhine first with a hastily organized assault that succeeded through speed and surprise. American armies drove deep into Germany, while Montgomery was still consolidating his bridgehead. The race to Berlin became another source of Anglo-American tension. Montgomery wanted to drive for Berlin, believing it was the key to ending the war and to post-war political arrangements. Eisenhower decided to halt at the Elbe River and let Soviet forces take Berlin. This decision was based on military logic. Berlin was in the Soviet zone of occupation, and the cost of taking it would be high. But it also reflected political calculations about the post-war world. Montgomery's demands after the Battle of the Bulge revealed several important things. First, they showed his genuine belief in his own superiority as a commander. Montgomery wasn't being cynically political. He genuinely believed he was the best general in the Allied forces, and that the war would be won more quickly and efficiently under his command. This wasn't entirely unjustified. Montgomery was a skilled commander who had won important victories. Second, they revealed his blindness to political reality. Montgomery seemed unable to understand that military command in a coalition is as much about politics as tactics. His demands were politically impossible, and his public statements were politically disastrous. A more politically astute commander would have recognized this. Third, they showed the fundamental tension between British and American military cultures. British forces in 1945 were exhausted after 5 years of war. Britain had mobilized its entire society and was reaching the limits of its manpower. British commanders were necessarily cautious about casualties. American forces were relatively fresh, with vast reserves of manpower and material. American commanders could afford to be more aggressive. Fourth, Montgomery's demands illustrated the changing balance of power within the Western Alliance. In 1940 and 1941, Britain had stood alone. By 1945, American power was dominant. This shift was difficult for British commanders and politicians to accept. Montgomery's demands were partly an attempt to maintain British influence and prestige in the face of this changing reality. The aftermath of Montgomery's demands had lasting consequences. The command structure remained as Eisenhower had established it. American armies made the main effort in the final drive into Germany. Montgomery's 21st Army Group advanced in the north, but was not given the resources for the concentrated thrust he wanted. The broad front strategy continued until Germany's surrender in May 1945. Personally, Montgomery's reputation in America never recovered. He was seen as arrogant, ungrateful, and dismissive of American sacrifice. His press conference after the bulge was remembered as an insult. Even decades later, American veterans of the European campaign spoke bitterly of Montgomery. In Britain, he remained a hero, but even there, some recognized that his political skills hadn't matched his tactical abilities. The relationship between Eisenhower and Montgomery remained professional, but cool. Eisenhower's post-war memoirs were diplomatic, but made clear his frustrations with Montgomery. Montgomery's memoirs were characteristically self-serving, claiming credit for victories and blaming others for setbacks. The two men represented different approaches to coalition warfare and high command. What's often forgotten is that Montgomery's criticisms of American command weren't entirely wrong. The American forces in the Ardennes had been surprised and initially overwhelmed. Intelligence failures had missed the German buildup. Some American units had performed poorly in the initial shock. The broad front strategy did spread Allied forces thin. Montgomery's tactical decisions during the bulge, pulling back exposed units and establishing a solid defensive line, were sound. But Montgomery's solution, giving him overall command and adopting his strategy, wasn't the answer. The problems in the Ardennes were corrected by American commanders and American troops. The relief of Bastogne, the stabilization of the northern shoulder, and the eventual counterattack were primarily American achievements. Montgomery's role, while useful, was supporting rather than decisive. The Battle of the Bulge and its aftermath also revealed something about armored warfare that Montgomery never fully grasped. Tanks weren't just mobile artillery to support infantry advances, which was largely how Montgomery used them. American commanders, particularly Patton, understood that armor could be used for rapid exploitation, deep penetration, and operational maneuver. Patton's relief of Bastogne demonstrated this perfectly. When Montgomery claimed that American tanks had broken his entire strategy, he was revealing his own limitations. His strategy assumed that armored forces would advance methodically, with careful preparation and overwhelming force at the point ground command, a concentrated northern thrust, and a supporting role for American forces. These demands were based on his genuine belief in his own superiority and his conviction that his methods were correct. But these demands were politically impossible, strategically questionable, and tactically outdated. They revealed Montgomery's strengths as a careful, thorough commander who could organize complex operations, but they also revealed his weaknesses, his political blindness, his inability to adapt to new realities, and his dismissive attitude toward allies. The controversy over Montgomery's demands and his press conference nearly broke the Allied coalition at a critical moment. It required intervention from Churchill and firmness from Eisenhower to resolve. It left lasting bitterness and damaged Anglo-American military relations. And ultimately, it changed nothing. The war continued under Eisenhower's command, with the broad front strategy, and with American forces playing the dominant role. Montgomery would go on to receive the German surrender at Lüneburg Heath in May 1945, a fitting honor for Britain's most famous general. He would serve as Chief of the Imperial General Staff after the war and as Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe during the early Cold War. But his reputation, particularly in America, never recovered from the controversies of late 1944 and early 1945. The story of what Montgomery demanded after American tanks broke his strategy is really a story about coalition warfare, about clashing military cultures, about the transition from British to American dominance in the Western Alliance, and about the limits of even talented commanders when they fail to understand political reality. It's a reminder that in coalition warfare, political skill is as important as tactical brilliance, and that the best military plan is worthless if it destroys the alliance it's supposed to serve. Montgomery was a skilled commander who won important victories, but his demands after the Battle of the Bulge showed that skill in battle doesn't always translate to wisdom in coalition management. The Allied victory in Europe was achieved despite these tensions, not because of them, through the determination of soldiers, the resources of nations, and the diplomatic skill of leaders like Eisenhower and Churchill, who understood that winning the war required keeping the alliance together.